Of the many figures who have come to symbolize indigenous resistance in North America, few loom as large as Geronimo, the fearless Apache leader who spent years defying both Mexican and U.S. authorities in a struggle to preserve his people's freedom. His name evokes images of daring escapes, desert campaigns across rugged southwestern terrain, and the complexity of a person at once revered as a champion of Apache sovereignty, yet viewed as a relentless foe by those he battled. In this 40,000-character magazine-style article, we embark on an in-depth exploration of Geronimo's life, from his early experiences on the harsh frontier to the final years of captivity, and the enduring impact of his legacy on Native American rights and historical memory. The Apache are a group of culturally related tribes, including the Chiricahua, Mescalero, Western Apache, Jicarilla, Lipan, and others, historically inhabiting a vast region of what is now the southwestern United States, particularly Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Texas, and extending into northern Mexico. Their ancestors migrated south centuries earlier, adopting a semi-nomadic lifestyle, adept at hunting, gathering, and raiding. Apache groups varied in dialect and customs, but shared core beliefs in spiritual harmony with the land and revered warrior traditions. Geronimo, or Go Yahweh in his native language, meaning the one who yawns, was a Chiricahua Apache. His band roamed the mountainous deserts of the southwestern frontier, forging alliances or rivalries with neighboring peoples and adapting to the realities of Spanish, then Mexican, and ultimately U.S. expansions. Among the diverse Apache communities, the Chiricahua were known for their fierce independence and strategic cunning in warfare. Their territory stretched across the Sierra Madre Range in Mexico, the Dragoon Mountains of southeastern Arizona, and beyond. They practiced seasonal movement, exploiting mountainous refuges and water sources. The clan-based social structure meant leadership was fluid, often determined by proven prowess and communal respect. The Chiricahua worldview interwove all aspects of life with spiritual significance. Ceremonies called upon mountain spirits for healing or success in raids. The scarcities of desert life required forging strong group cohesion, and interband conflict or foreign intrusion sparked immediate, if sporadic, resistance. Initially, Apaches encountered Spanish and Mexican colonists, engaging in trade and conflict. The cycle of raiding and retaliatory campaigns shaped the Apaches' posture toward external powers. As the 19th century progressed, the arrival of Americans, particularly after the Mexican-American War 1846 to 1848, introduced a new dimension of territorial disputes that escalated the Apache struggle. Early life of Geronimo, birth and family. Geronimo was likely born in June 1829 near the upper Gila River region in what is now southwestern New Mexico. His birth name, Go Yahweh, is often translated as "he who yawns," though some believe it points more to a calm or unassuming demeanor in youth. He belonged to the Bedonkohe band of the Chiricahua. Much of his early life was shaped by typical Apache youth training, learning hunting, riding, survival, and raiding tactics under the tutelage of elders and warriors. He developed skill with bow, lance, and the up-and-coming repeating rifles that would later influence Apache warfare strategies. Marriage and family tragedy. By young adulthood, Go Yahweh had married and become a father. Traditional sources mention he had multiple wives over his lifetime, which was not uncommon in Apache communities. However, a pivotal tragedy struck while he was away on a trading visit. His wife, mother, and 3 children were reportedly massacred in a surprise Mexican raid on their encampment, circa 1851. This loss profoundly shaped his animosity toward Mexican authorities, fueling a personal vendetta. The name Geronimo is said to have originated from Mexican soldiers calling upon Saint Jerome, Geronimo, in desperate pleas during raids when they faced his fierce onslaught. The Apaches versus 2 nations, Mexico and the United States, raiding and retribution. For decades, Apaches endured Spanish, then Mexican attempts to subjugate them. Raids into Sonora and Chihuahua were a matter of both survival, securing horses, livestock, and supplies, and vengeance for injustices. Mexican governments mounted punitive campaigns, offering bounties for Apache scalps. The cycle of violence deepened mutual hostility. When the United States took control of vast southwestern territories, via the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848, and the Gadsden Purchase, 1853, Apaches found themselves dealing with new settlers and U.S. Army outposts. Conflict soared as gold rush adventurers, ranchers, and railroad interests pressed into Apache lands. The emergence of Geronimo as a key figure. Geronimo was neither a hereditary chief nor originally recognized as the highest Chiricahua leader. Figures like Cochise or Mangas Coloradas overshadowed him in formal leadership. But Geronimo's relentless will, success in raids, and refusal to bow to either Mexican or U.S. demands catapulted him to prominence. 1850s to 1860s. He joined campaigns under more established chiefs, proving his courage. Over time, he led smaller war parties targeting outposts or ranches. 1860s, 1880s, as older leaders died or were captured, Geronimo took on more direct, recognized leadership in the continuing struggle. By the mid-1870s, the U.S. government's solution for Apache conflict was forced relocation to reservations, such as San Carlos in Arizona. The conditions on these reservations were harsh: poor rations, minimal farmland, oppressive oversight by Indian agents. Many Apaches, including Geronimo, found these conditions intolerable. Geronimo repeatedly left the reservation with a band of followers, retreating into the Sierra Madre Mountains in northern Mexico to evade or raid. Each time, the U.S. Army would attempt to capture or negotiate his return. The tension soared as settlers demanded harsh measures against renegades who ventured off-reservation. Victorio's War and Apache resistance. Although not as widely famed as Geronimo, another prominent leader, Victorio, launched extensive campaigns in the late 1870s. Victorio's death in 1880 left a leadership vacuum in certain Apache circles, which Geronimo partly filled. He continued orchestrating cunning raids and repeatedly outmaneuvered pursuing forces. Notable tactics: using mountainous terrain and ephemeral water sources for advantage, swift dispersal into small raiding parties, deep knowledge of canyons and desert, outrunning cavalry and circumventing heavily guarded passes. The last major outbreak of hostilities began in 1885, when Geronimo again bolted from the San Carlos reservation with 40 Apaches, including warriors, women, and children. Over the next year, they led the U.S. Army on a furious chase across Arizona, New Mexico, and into Mexico. General George Crook's pursuit. Crook used Apache scouts loyal to the U.S. to track Geronimo's group. Peace talks ensued in 1886, but Geronimo, suspicious of betrayal, fled once more. Crook faced censure for failing to secure the final surrender. General Nelson Miles replaced Crook, deploying thousands of troops and advanced telegraph lines to coordinate. The relentless pursuit eventually cornered Geronimo. In September 1886, exhausted and with only a handful of loyal warriors, Geronimo surrendered near the Mexican border to General Miles, marking the official end of the Apache Wars. The U.S. reneged on amnesty promises, shipping Geronimo's group east as prisoners of war. Surrender and prisoner of war status. Florida and Alabama detention. Right after surrender, Geronimo's band was forcibly relocated. Florida, they were first held at Fort Pickens, Pensacola, and Fort Marion San Agustin. The climate and disease took a toll. Family separation. The U.S. Army separated men from women and children. Hardship soared due to poor living conditions, unfamiliar diseases, and emotional trauma. Later, the group was placed at Mount Vernon Barracks near Mobile, continuing a restricted existence. Moved to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. In 1894, the remnants of Geronimo's band, still POWs, were transferred to Fort Sill in the Indian Territory, now Oklahoma. There, they lived in stifling captivity but had slightly more freedom to farm small plots. Geronimo, aging, turned to new experiences. He attended expositions and fairs, like the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, displayed as a living curiosity, a situation he partly exploited to sell souvenirs or autographs, though it was a humiliating symbol of captivity. He converted, at least nominally, to Christianity, was baptized as a means of adapting to the forced assimilation environment. Geronimo died on February 17, 1909, at Fort Sill, never fully regaining his freedom. 6. Personality and leadership. 6.1 Contrasts in character. To Apaches, Geronimo was a spiritual figure, rumored to have shamanistic powers, revered for cunning, resilience, and unwavering stand against colonial aggression. He displayed boldness in raids and negotiations, albeit sometimes overshadowed by other Apache leaders like Cochise or Mangas Coloradas in earlier decades. Yet his name rose to iconic status due to his final stand. To U.S. authorities, he was a persistent threat, a hostile who repeatedly defied treaties. The press portrayed him as a ruthless savage. Modern historians note the complexity. He could be merciless to enemies, but also a devoted caretaker for his band, ensuring women and children survived. 6.2 The War Path and Spiritual Beliefs. Geronimo recounted episodes where he believed supernatural power protected him in battle, referencing dreams or visions. This spiritual dimension impacted his raiding strategies, fueling a sense of invincibility. Some accounts described him as stoic, rarely showing fear or regret, except for the personal tragedy that ignited his vendetta. Geronimo's repeated breakouts from reservations exemplified the broader refusal of many Apaches to settle under external subjugation. His band's defiance forced the U.S. Army to commit enormous resources, thousands of troops, Apache scouts, and advanced logistics, to chase fewer than 50 warriors plus families across a vast desert. His final surrender symbolized the end of major armed Apache resistance. After 1886, the era of Indian wars in the southwestern United States closed, replaced by forced assimilation, reservation confinement, and fleeting glimpses of self-determination. The reservation system, championed as a solution by U.S. officials, systematically dismantled many aspects of Apache cultural life. Traditional religious ceremonies faced restrictions. Forced schooling separated children from parents. Hunting and raiding replaced by dependent rations from government agencies. Despite these pressures, the Apaches strove to maintain cultural identity. Geronimo's stance continues to serve as a historical symbol of defiance, highlighting the cost at which the southwestern frontier was pacified. Geronimo's name pervades American cultural references, films and novels. Hollywood westerns often caricatured him as a savage renegade. More modern portrayals nuance his motivations and the complexity of the Apache plight. Military code name, oddly, Geronimo became a Woe-2 paratrooper battle cry, signifying a fearless jump. Later, controversies arose over the U.S. military using Geronimo as a code name for operations. Some Apache and native groups found it disrespectful. Media sensationalism. Contemporary newspapers in the 1880s demonized Geronimo, fueling public fear. Over time, contrarian narratives recognized him as a patriot for his people. Decades after his death, some U.S. officials expressed regret for the harsh treatment. Late 20th century historians recontextualized Apaches like Geronimo not as mere outlaws but as indigenous defenders resisting expansionist policies. Meanwhile, controversy lingers over the location of his remains and rumored disturbances by secret societies in the early 1900s. For many Native Americans, Geronimo is both an emblem of unwavering resistance and a cautionary tale of entrapment. By the 1960s and 1970s, new indigenous rights movements cited figures like Geronimo, Crazy Horse, and Chief Joseph as icons. These figures galvanized activism for tribal sovereignty, cultural revitalization, and treaty rights. Exploring key episodes in Geronimo's life. Geronimo's band often retreated into the Sierra Madre in Chihuahua or Sonora. The harsh mountainous terrain provided natural fortresses. Although Mexico launched repeated expeditions, local militias seldom overcame Apache cunning. Even when federal troops cooperated with U.S. cavalry, Geronimo's group slipped away, sowing terror among ranchers. The cross-border nature of Apache raids complicated efforts by either the Mexican or U.S. government to secure a definitive peace. Diplomatic tensions escalated, each side accusing the other of insufficient border policing. Though overshadowed by his war leadership, Geronimo also claimed spiritual abilities. He performed small cures or blessings. Some Apaches said he had strong power for prophecy and protection, possibly from personal visions. This mystical dimension is partly why men followed him, even when larger Apache leaders counseled peace. Throughout the 1870s and 1880s, Geronimo surrendered multiple times, only to flee again when trust broke down. The final surrender to General Nelson Miles in 1886 near Skeleton Canyon was iconic. Miles insisted on unconditional terms. Geronimo, accompanied by a few warriors, women, and children, accepted no illusions but saw no alternative. He parted with the promise that eventually they'd be freed from POW status. Geronimo was labeled a murderous savage by many 19th century American newspapers. Yet from an Apache perspective, he fought for survival. retaliating after atrocities befalling his family and people. Modern scholarship recognizes that while his raids were violent, so too were the forced relocations, broken treaties, and campaigns that tried to eliminate Apache autonomy. From a southwestern vantage, Geronimo is a legend akin to a revolutionary icon, someone who refused subjugation to external dominion. For younger Apaches, stories of his determination and spiritual resilience continue to inspire cultural pride. His name has become a staple in Western pop culture, overshadowing the deeper complexities of indigenous struggle. Some Apaches question the fixation on Geronimo when other leaders, e.g. Cochise Victorio, had equally profound roles. This highlights how external media latched onto Geronimo's persona, in part due to the sensational coverage of his final campaigns. Comparison with other indigenous leaders Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. On the northern plains, leaders like Crazy Horse or Sitting Bull similarly led armed resistance against encroaching U.S. forces. All these figures, including Geronimo, ended up facing grim consequences, forced captivity or violent death. Each remains a revered figure in respective tribal histories, representing a final stand for freedom. Tecumseh of the Shawnee worked to form a confederacy to resist U.S. expansion in the early 19th century. Like Geronimo, he was a dynamic figure whose stance drew admiration from allies and fear from adversaries. The difference lies in geographic scope, but both men underscore how different tribes reacted in parallel to unstoppable colonial expansions. Chronicling Geronimo's later years. Once forcibly relocated to Fort Sill, Geronimo became somewhat of a public curiosity. He was invited to the Trans-Mississippian International Exposition in Omaha, 1898, and the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, where people paid to see the famous Apache Savage. He autographed souvenirs or posed for pictures, an uneasy compromise to earn money in captivity. Late in life, under the influences of missionary presence, Geronimo was baptized into the Dutch Reformed Church. Historians differ on whether his conversion was heartfelt or pragmatic. He died in 1909 after pneumonia struck when he fell from a horse in cold weather. On his deathbed, it said he regretted surrendering. Evaluating the impact on Native American policy. The end of Apache resistance. Geronimo's 1886 surrender concluded the last major southwestern conflict of the so-called Indian Wars. Post-Geronimo, the U.S. government implemented more assimilationist policies, boarding schools, allotment acts, accelerating the breakdown of traditional native life. Apaches were scattered among reservations in Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Arizona, deeply affecting their cultural continuity. Federal shifts. The U.S. approach toward indigenous peoples gradually moved from outright military campaigns to forced assimilation and paternalistic oversight by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Geronimo's final capitulation reaffirmed to many policymakers that all tribes would eventually be subdued. Modern memory and reconciliation preservation of Apache culture. In contemporary times, Apache tribes navigate the legacy of figures like Geronimo by fostering cultural revitalization programs, linguistic retention, ceremonial revival, and the retelling of heroic lore. Institutions such as the White Mountain Apache in Arizona have museums and cultural centers where aspects of Geronimo's story are integrated. Controversies over remains. A persistent rumor suggests that members of the secret society Skull and Bones exhumed Geronimo's remains from Fort Sill, removing his skull to Yale University's campus. Apache descendants have petitioned for repatriation, though the evidence remains inconclusive. The case underscores ongoing issues around indigenous remains and ancestral rights, symbol for indigenous rights. Over the 20th and 21st centuries, Geronimo's name frequently surfaced in protests, art, and scholarship, symbolizing defiance against oppression. The complexities of celebrating a war leader who participated in violent raids are balanced by understanding the colonial setting in which such resistance arose. Geronimo's enduring mystique. Cinematic and literary legacy. Hollywood westerns like Geronimo, 1939, or Geronimo, an American Legend, 1993, alternately demonized or romanticized him. Novelists and historians have attempted more balanced portrayals, highlighting the tragedy of forced relocations and Geronimo's unwavering desire to live freely on Apache land. Lessons for today. Geronimo's story exemplifies the broader indigenous struggle globally. Themes of resistance to colonization, attempts at negotiation, and the heartbreak of failing to protect one's homeland speak across cultures. His saga teaches about the cost of unstoppable expansions, the resilience of minority groups, and how a single individual can become an emblem for an entire people's defiance. Geronimo, the storied Chiricahua Apache icon, lived through an era of wrenching change. As southwestern deserts once dominated by indigenous tribes were overtaken by encroaching Mexican, then U.S. frontiers. Losing family at the hands of Mexican troops ignited in him a determined vendetta, fueling raids that spanned decades. To the American Army, he was an elusive menace. To fellow Apaches, a fierce protector, refusing to concede tribal sovereignty. Ultimately, overwhelming military might forced him into repeated surrenders, culminating in a final exile that ended with his death as a prisoner of war. Yet, more than a century later, Geronimo's name resonates as a testament to the complexities of Native American history. His story underscores how personal grief, cultural survival, and the unstoppable tide of territorial ambition collided in the southwestern frontier. While many Apaches and other Native communities continue to re-examine his legacy, acknowledging both the brutality of his raids and the desperation that fueled them, he endures as a symbol of resistance against oppression. A figure who reminds us that every corner of North America was once fiercely contested ground. In the grand narrative of indigenous and colonial encounters, Geronimo's legendary cunning, repeated escapes, and ultimate captivity reveal not just the tragedy of his personal journey, but the broader trajectory of Native American dispossession in the late 19th century. His memory stands at the intersection of myth, folklore, and historical fact, bridging centuries of conflict with ongoing calls for recognition, respect, and sovereign rights among Native peoples. Select bibliography and further reading. DeBow Angie. Geronimo, The Man, His Time, His Place. University of Oklahoma Press, 1976. Geronimo, Geronimo's Story of His Life, as told to S.M. Barrett, 1906. Ball, Eve, Inde, and Apache Odyssey. University of Oklahoma Press, 1988. Sweeney Edwin R. Mongus Coloradas, Chief of the Chiricahua Apaches. University of Oklahoma Press, 1998. Thrapp Danell, The Conquest of Apacheria. University of Oklahoma Press, 1975. Utley, Robert M. Geronimo. Yale University Press, 2012. Roberts, David. Once They Moved Like the Wind, Cochise Geronimo and the Apache Wars. Simon & Schuster, 1993. Haley, James L. Apaches, A History and Culture Portrait. University of Oklahoma Press, 1997.